Yeah, let me start today's sessions. My name is Daisaku Higashi. I'm a professor at Sophia University in Tokyo. Today I will moderate these sessions, and let me share my slide just to explain the purpose of today's sessions. I think, and the title of our session is Traditional or Empowering Traditional Conflict Resolution Mechanism in Peace Buildings. And the purpose of conducting this session is that I think there's a growing awareness that empowering the traditional conflict resolution mechanisms, what we call TCRM, is quite important in the process of the peace buildings. And one of the reasons I think is that it takes time, or it might take many, many years for post-conflict states to establish effective, modern, and Western type of justice systems. For example, in order to solve the local conflict, including water dispute or land dispute. So it might be important to empower the traditional conflict resolution mechanism, but the question is how, especially when TCRM might have some contradiction with UN values. So I'd like to pursue this question with great speakers and also extinguished participants, so that we can, we can deepen the understanding and hopefully some recommendation for the future steps. Today, I'm very happy, I'm very honored to have great speakers, including Dr. Rural Deng, who is a management, it's not changing yet, but the management director of Ebony Center in South Sudan. Ebony Center is the biggest think tank in the South Sudan, so I'm very happy to have him today for these sessions. We also have a Professor Eise Kurimoto, who is at Osaka University in Japan, but who is one of the leading anthropologists in Japan and who studied South Sudan for almost more than 40 years. So I think he's a wonderful and very great speakers in terms of speaking these topics. And I also make some presentations about why TCLM might be quite important in the context of the peace building, because I'm an expert on the peace buildings. We are also very happy that Dr. Arista Edgar kindly will give us some comment after the presentation by the three persons. And then we will have we would like to have a Q&A as much as possible. So we really appreciate the participation by the Alistair, who is a long-time friend and who used to be the executive director for the Academic Council on the UN system for a long time. Let me explain a little bit about South Sudan, because it's one of the important cases for today. South Sudan is located in the central part of the Africa. And the South Sudan became independent in July 2011, after 50 years of independence, almost independence war. And in July 2013, unfortunately, Riek Machar, vice president of South Sudan, was fired by President Salva Kiir. In December 2013, civil war started in the South Sudan. August 2015, peace agreement between President Kiir and Riek Machar was signed. And April 2016, Riek Machar returned to Juba and the Transitional Government of National Unity was formed. But only 2 months later, a military clash between those two factions erupted again. So those are like President Kiir, who represented Dinka, the biggest tribe or ethnic factions in South Sudan, and the Vice President Machar, who represented Nuer. December 2017, the revitalized peace process was started, and September 2018, peace agreement for making the revitalized transitional government national unity was signed between those factions and another political factions. And February this year, 2020, Riek Machar returned to Juba as a vice president, and the revitalized transitional government national unity was established. So this is the current situations, and I'd like to give Dr. Rural Deng about what is the current stage of the peace process and how he see the importance of the empowering traditional conflict resolution mechanism. So thank you very much. So Alistair, floor is yours.
Alison or Lual Deng? Who is?
No, not Alison, but Luar. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Dr. Luar, you have the floor.
No
Yes.
problem. Thank you very much. And I take this opportunity to thank you and the other colleagues on the panel and the organizers for this important opportunity. Could you please put my slide on?
Yep.
Make it easier. And next slide, next slide, please. Yes. So the latest situation of peace in South Sudan, the revitalized transitional government of national unity was established in February 2020, and actually should have been established in 2019. So there was some delays. That's the executive. So normally when we talk of government, there are three branches. It's only one branch, the executive, which has been established. The legislature is not yet constituted. 9 out of 10 states governors have been appointed, but no state government, cabinet, and legislature, parliament, states not yet. Unified army not yet formed. Public financial management reform strategy, as stipulated in chapter 4 of the ARSAS. ARSAS stands for Revitalized Peace Agreement in South Sudan, has started. That's good news. And then no progress with respect to chapter 5, which is dealing on healing and reconciliation. Next slide, please. And hybrid court is not yet established. Return of IDPs from internally displaced camps, from the protection of civilian side within the UN, and refugees across the borders have not yet returned. Ceasefire is holding, though the non-signatories to the peace agreement are not observing it, so there are some clashes in this greater Equatoria. A national dialogue process, which is really a bottom-up approach, which is a synergy between national dialogue and the agreement, because the agreement was basically negotiated by elite, and it is a top-down process, while the national dialogue is a bottom-up approach. It's concluding after 3 years, and the final conference will take place in November this year. And so it gives some hope there, because through the national dialogue grassroots consultation, 4 issues were identified to be the causes of conflict. That is weak governance, economy not working well, insecurity, and social conflict all over the country. Next. Yeah, so that's basically giving what the peace situation, peace agreement, how it stands in South Sudan. Now, coming back to the importance of the traditional conflict resolution mechanism, and here is not my area, and I'm happy that Professor Kurumoto is an expert. He will look at some of those, but from my perspective, there are 4 components that really make the TCRM important. And I leave those parts to be elaborated by Professor Kurumoto when his time comes. But the first one is restorative, which focuses on restoring harmony and tranquility to the community and society and nation, which is very important. So instead of, it doesn't focus on punishment, but more on restoring stability, trust, confidence to the community. So this is a very important component of TCRM. And the second is consensual, which is focusing on building a consensus among the warring parties and people, and can sit for days, weeks, and even months talking on issues, creating disharmony within the community until each and every participant has spoken. Even if one person has not spoken, people will continue to persuade him until he speaks. And that is a long process, but it is important, because in a way you are encouraging people to be committed to what has been agreed. And the third component is compensation, and which focus on, so say for instance, if a person killed, you don't need to introduce capital punishment, which is existing in the West, is a Western concept. You compensate, they call it the blood compensation. So normally in South Sudan, most of the cattle owning societies, people have to pay in terms of cattle to compensate for a person who has been lost. And other damages, of course, are compensated that way. And the first and final component of the TCRM is ritual, whereby at the end of this, the binding constraint or the binding agreement is done through focusing on blessing of what has been agreed upon, making sacrifices, killing bulls, people jumping over these slaughtered animals, and people will be saying, if you violate, the spirit of the animals which have been killed will run after you. So in that way, there's a binding agreement that what we have agreed upon, it will be respected. And this, which is different from the peace agreement as we know it, and as at the introduction, it was said that this peace agreement is called revitalized peace agreement. The first one was 2015. It collapsed in 2016, and the new one has started. Is not holding. Is delaying, and it is because it is being done by the elite, and it is top down, supported by the international community, and it is kind of a top down approach. It's not using traditional mechanisms. I think I would. I still have about 5 minutes, but at this stage, I would save time to pass it to others so that give us more time maybe to answer questions for those people who've been asking. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rural Deng. It was very concise and precise, and it gave us very good understanding about what is a key component of the traditional conflict resolution mechanisms, as well as the current situation of the peace process in the South Sudan. I will encourage many participants to send a question to the question and answer functions. Maybe you have a kind of a chat system, but you can use the question and answer system to send the question to us, so that after 3 presentations and 1 comment, we will start responding to your question. So thank you very much, Mr. Durareng again. And next one is Mr. Professor Kurimoto. Can
Yes.
you start speaking? Yep.
Yeah. Please put on my PowerPoint. Yep. And the next page. Anyway, Dr. Luo, thanks very much for summarizing the key components of the TCRM, and I completely agree with you. To start with my argument, please look at the point number 2. And I'm saying we need to admit that peace building programs that were implemented during the CPA period, this is after the peace agreement between 2005 and 11 in the Southern Sudan, well, before independence, proved to be a total failure, regardless of the massive resources poured in. When we look at what has happened after December 2013, when the civil war started. We need a thorough examination of what went wrong, So in my presentation, I talk about peace from above and peace from below. Peace from above is refers to the peace building programs implemented by the international community, including the UN and the government of Southern Sudan and the government of South Sudan. And peace from below, or grassroots peace building refers to the initiatives by people themselves using TCR. Next slide, please. If we look at the society of South Sudan today, people have been very deeply divided, and we can see the grave hostilities among people. It developed for the last 4 decades since 1983, and these hostilities we can find not only between ethnic groups but also among the same ethnic group, even between villages of the same ethnic group, and even within a village. And the dividing lines have been shifting all the time because of political and military situations. And also we need to acknowledge that how people of Southern Sudan look at state or government. And it certainly it is different from how people in developed countries look at the government or state. And for many people, state is something outside of the community, which is not only good, and in many cases it is bad for the people. Then number three, and you know, the people of South Sudan is very remarkable in their ability to survive. They have been surviving for the last 4 decades and reconstructing communities. And it becomes possible if free movement of the people and sharing natural resources, in particular in borderlands between groups, are possible. But today, because of rural insecurity and instability, the situation makes the people's means of livelihood very difficult. So people are put in a situation where their ability of survival cannot be exercised. And that is the reason why so many refugees and IDPs cannot go back home because of rural insecurity and instability. Next, please. Next page, please. Let's skip this page. Next page. Yeah, this one. Yes. We can identify so many types of TCRMs in the context of South Sudan. There are a variety of offices, hereditary offices and institutions, such as kings, chiefs, and rainmakers who have the power to control rain. That's how people say. And peacemakers, and in the case of Dinka, masters of the fishing spear. In the case of Nuer, leopard skin chiefs or priests, and the prophets. And also in some communities, they have council of elders or a council of middle-aged men. In particular, in some part of Equatoria, they call it Monyomiji system. It's a council of middle-aged men. And what is important is that in many cases, those traditional leaders, they are both for war and peace. So they can be a peacemaker and war maker at the same time. And also what is remarkable is that the home of traditional leaders is a kind of sanctuary, or if we use that German term, Asyl, which in English, this is the root of asylum. Uh, it is a sanctuary where asylum seekers are protected and violence is prohibited. And that is how, how the palace of Shiruk King and the homes of masters of the Dinka masters of fishing spear with the shrines have never been attacked since the 1980s. So this status of sanctuary has been very much respected. And the next point is already pointed out by Dr. Lual. And usually these negotiations for peace and reconciliation takes time. And the conclusion is always consensual. And need to be participated by many people, hundreds of people, or sometimes even thousands, for weeks, even for months. And this is where support from outside is necessary. In particular, for transportation of the people and logistics. Somebody need to provide at least water and food and shelter during for the peace and reconciliation conferences. And the conclusion is achieved by the payment of compensation, usually in the form of cattle, and followed by ritual of purification and reconciliation, and sacrifice of animals, of which meat is eaten together by all participants. Okay, to consolidate the unity of the people. Next, please. So let's skip this one. What I want to emphasize is that TCRMs are not almighty. They are very effective, but they are not almighty, because in many cases the authority of traditional leaders and people's trust in them have been very much waned and eroded as a result of prolonged civil wars. And in particular, among the young people, the culture of violence, of a culture of the gun, have been prevailed. So they are very defiant. They don't listen to elders. And also those young people, they have militarized mentality and behavior. So that's how, in some cases, TCRMs have been eroded. And so that is why we argue that there's a need to revitalize and institutionalize TCRMs. And also, there is a need to update them to fit the modern situation. And when I say to update it, it should be done in a way to overcome structural shortcomings of the TCRMs. Because TCRMs are almost always male dominated. And it has a patriarchal aspect. So it should be revised or modified so that it can include women in particular and youth. Next. I just want to show you two photos from Eastern Equatoria. On the left is a typical village setting under tree. And you can also see some UNMISS, UN peacekeeping police officers. And what is remarkable is that the men are sitting above and the women are sitting on this side.
Mm.
You know, they are together, but they sit separately. And on the right is in a modern setting. It's a state hotel in the Eastern Equatorial State, Torit town, where we organized Peace and Reconciliation Conference in 2000. Just a mistake, 2009. Next, please. Let us think about why peace building and the reconstruction failed during the CPA period. You know, and what I did not say clearly is that before the CPA period, during the last phase of the war, there were a lot of grassroots peace building efforts were done before the peace agreement. But after the peace agreement, they were somehow neglected because too much emphasis was put on state building at the expense of nation building. And resources were concentrated at the center, that is the capital city, Juba, and rural areas are very much neglected. And they failed to establish an effective and democratic system of local administration. And also the power and the wealth was monopolized by a small circle of ruling elite. And we could see the widespread phenomenon of nepotism, tribalism, and corruption. So that's how people to people peace or peace from below were neglected during the period. And next one, I think this is the final. Next.
Yeah, I think this is the last one. Yeah.
Yeah. So before me, Dr. Lual then talked about the ongoing process of national dialogue, which is very, very important. And that national dialogue, for instance, should be coordinated or with the different kinds of peace and reconciliation efforts at the local level. So I want to emphasize that there is a dire need to harmonize the two approaches, peace from below and peace from above. And there is a gap between the two, and that gap need to be bridged. And the two opposite approaches need to be harmonized. And so that is my conclusion. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kurimoto and Professor Kurimoto. And yeah, I sincerely appreciate your such a detailed guidance and analysis about the traditional conflict resolution mechanism in the context of the South Sudan. So let me do my own presentation, and then I will ask Mr. or Dr. Alistair to make some comment, and then we will start having Q&A. So please, yeah, if you have some question, please send your questions in the written form to the question and answer box. So today I'd like to explain a little bit about what has been motive of pursuing these topics I'd like to share two experiences which convinced me of the importance of the TCRMs. One is from Afghanistan, the second is from South Sudan. And I'd like to make some temporary idea about the policy recommendations so that we can have some discussion on what is the exact way to empower traditional conflict resolution mechanisms. The motive of doing this research or project is that I had a chance to have a discussion with one of the ASG, Assistant Secretary General in DPP and DPO at UN headquarters last March 2019. And this ASG really emphasized to me that there is a conflict resolution or traditional conflict resolution mechanism in Africa. But in many cases, UN peacekeeping operations do not have enough understanding about those traditional conflict resolution mechanisms. And that could be one of the reasons why there are so many challenges in the operation of the UN peacekeeping and the UN peacebuilding operations. So this ASG requested me to and also this person emphasized that it tends to be like anthropologists who has a great understanding about this kind of traditional conflict resolution mechanism. So this person requested me to think about how we can actually utilize those expertise of the anthropologists and the specific context or state context or specific context expertise on the UN peacebuilding or UN field missions. So that was one of the reasons why I started this project, because I'm not an anthropologist, but I think that it's very important topics. And I co-organized the first seminar with Professor Primoto and the representative Department of Policy and Evaluation and Training in DPO at United Nations, Department of Peace Operations, and the Peacebuilding Support Office, and the mediation in Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs on 10th March 2020. And so this is a kind of second opportunity for me to share our, awareness and think about what is the best way to improve this situation. Let me share my experience in Afghanistan first, about which really convinced me of the importance of traditional conflict resolution mechanisms. I had a chance to conduct academic research in 2008, and I made a lot of individual interviews, including the Ministry of Rural Rehabilitation and Development and the Minister of Finance. I also collected opinion survey from 260 villagers from 3 provinces, Kandahar province, Warda province, and the Capital province. And one of the important questions are about how they feel about the need of the reconciliation with the Taliban. And I was very surprised that majority of Afghan people really supported kind of political settlement or reconciliation with the Taliban. About more than 94% of the people living in a Pashtun people living in a area responded to reconciliation with insurgent group, including the Taliban, is the first priority to establish a peace. And surprisingly, 98% of people responded in Kandahar, Wardak, and even 70% of the Tajik people living in Kapisa supported the kind of coalition government between the Afghan government and the Taliban, even in the time of 2008. So I published English report from UNDPKO and Japanese book, Peacebuilding in 2009, based on my field research, and I made some policy recommendation to support Afghan government to start reconciliation with the Taliban. And Japanese government announced that it would support the reconciliation and integration as one of 3 key strategies for assisting Afghanistan, pledging a $50 million to supporting the process. Simultaneously, I applied to UNAMA as a political officers, and I got the offer from UNAMA in the end of 2009. And I was assigned as a team leader for reconciliation and integration from December 2009 to December 2010 to support Afghan government to establish reconciliation mechanisms to start talking with the Taliban. So I needed to collect a lot of information about the Taliban or kind of policy of the Taliban to think about what is the best way to have political settlement with them. And I got a very interesting story from UNAMA national staff who said that there was a dispute by 2 villages, and the representative representative of the two villages made a lot of requests to the Afghan government, like a local, police, local court, provincial governors, to solve this conflict. But unfortunately, it did not work at all for 1 year. So in the end of the day, villagers decided to request the Taliban commanders in that area to come. And the next day, the Taliban commander came, and they organized Shura, which is a kind of traditional council to solve the conflict. And the Shura had a lot of intensive debate between those two villagers. And the next day, or third day, the Taliban made a verdict based on the Pashtunwali, which is kind of a code of the behavior, traditional code of the behavior, which exists for almost 1,000 years in the Pashtun areas. And on the fourth day, that verdict was implemented. So dispute was actually solved in the 4 days after the intervention by the Taliban. This is what I heard from the Afghan colleague in the UNAMA. And I think this story actually demonstrated that it actually takes time for not only Afghan government, but many central government in the post-conflict states to start having functioning justice systems to solve those kind of local conflicts. So it's maybe important to support and enhance traditional conflict resolution mechanisms, because solving those kind of local conflict, including a water dispute, land dispute, will strengthen the legitimacy of the central government that UN might actually support. But we often need to have some kind of adjustment, as Professor Kurimoto and Dr. Deng mentioned, to engage with local partners. Because it might not be the case that those traditional conflict resolution mechanisms have perfect matching with, for example, UN principles. So in this case, we need to have some adjustment in using a traditional conflict resolution mechanism. For instance, Shura in Afghanistan traditionally composed by only men. So this is quite important aspect about how to include women and also maybe youth into those traditional decision-making the process. I also believe that understanding Pashtunwali, the traditional code of the Pashtun for 1,000 years, is very crucial to support the peace negotiation or peace process between the Afghan government and the Taliban, because the Taliban really embrace this kind of traditional code, what we call the Pashtunwali. So understanding itself is quite important sometimes to support the peace process. The second experience that I wanted to share is my visit to the South Sudan in February and March 2019. Last year's, I was assigned by Japanese Foreign Minister to make some kind of intellectual contribution to peace building of the South Sudan. So I visited South Sudan for 5 days, and I interviewed like a Vice President of South Sudan, Minister in Cabinet Affairs, Minister of Higher Education, Dr. Pete Adwak, who used to be the Minister of the Higher Education, but he was really opposition to the government. And also I interviewed the head of the armies and also Ismail Weiss, IGAD Special Envoy for South Sudan. And also I interviewed Rural Deng. So I asked him to join this session today. I was very happy that I come to know Dr. Rural Deng in my visit. I also had a chance to share my research about the peace building at Juba universities. So I had a lot of voice from the student directories. But when I did this kind of research, both sides, or side of the both President Kiir and the Vice President Machar, argued that Wounded Peace Conference in 1999, which resulted in the reconciliation between the Dinka and the Nuer, is one of the most important examples for future national reconciliation, because they recognize that this Wounded Peace Conference really brought some kind of real reconciliations in the South Sudan at that time. And it was quite organized, very domestically, and also managed domestically by New Sudan Council of Churches, which play very important role in the traditional conflict resolution mechanism in the South Sudan. So I'm, unlike Professor Kurimoto, I'm not so familiar with those kind of traditional conflict resolution mechanism per se, but I was quite convinced that at least people in South Sudan believe that they have their own mechanism to make some national reconciliation, and that it's important to use it. And as Mr. or Dr. Rural Deng mentioned, the peace agreement signed in 2018 has been maintained by conflict parties in the South Sudan. And this is very good news. So there's a very drastic reduction of the conflict between the different political or military groups. But however, communal fightings over the resources like cars and water or cattle is being intensified in 2020, at least according to the report by the United Nations. So actually, first Vice President, Mr. Macha, met with traditional leaders from Jonglei State, which has very intensified, local conflict on 1st August 2020 to discuss how to deal with communal fighting. So it seems to me that there's a kind of idea that it's very important to hear the voice and also intellectuality and expertise from the traditional leaders on dealing with the traditional conflict or conflict over the resources. This is a picture of the meeting between the Vice President and the traditional leaders. So my final point that I want to make is that I think it's quite important for the United Nations to create the culture that UN PKO missions or UN special political missions at least can hire like anthropologists and country-specific experts as short-term consultant to obtain their knowledges, because they already have a knowledge, and their recommendation on how to enhance TCRMs. There's a reality that those kind of funding for the consultant or short-term contact is getting cut by the pressure of the member state. But I think it's quite important for UN mission to at least utilize those knowledge by anthropologists and the country-specific experts like Rural Deng or Professor Kurimoto to make good strategy on nation buildings. And I also believe that it's important to create a culture that UN mission can create a team to conduct some field work for mapping recent or current TCRM, as well as identifying influential local leader who can play a positive, not negative, but positive roles in solving local conflict and also enhancing national peace processes. So we might need to have some funding to create that kind of investigation teams. I also believe that it's good to have start some kind of pilot project collaborating with some UN mission to investigate the current situation of TCRM and how we can empower it. So South Sudan may need to have that kind of latest analysis because of the intensifying, because of the situation that the local conflict is intensifying now. And lastly, I also believe it's crucial for UN headquarters to gather lessons learned from different projects in the different conflict states on how to empower the TCRMs, so that we can get more and more knowledge or cases about what was a good way to empower the traditional conflict resolution mechanisms with some adjustment or making it reconciliatory for the UN value and the principles. So thank you very much for your attentions, and this is the end of my presentations. So if you have a question, please send a question to the question and answer box. And I'm very happy to get the comment from Alistair Edwards, who is a professor in Canada, but who was also executive director for Academic Council of the UN system for many, many, many years. So thank you very much, Alistair. Yeah, floor is yours.
Thank you, Daisaku. Many, many, many years makes me sound very old, and I certainly feel that way. Thank you very much also to all of the participants. And I've been looking in the Q&A box, and I know there are some very good and interesting questions in there for the speakers. So I will keep my comments brief. And I should also say, it may be boring because there's no controversy or difference of opinion between us, in the sense that I think we all value traditional conflict resolution mechanisms. We see the need for them. We see that they've been underutilized, if not ignored, by external peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping missions very often. So I just want to make 5 quick points, and I should say, I'm not an expert on South Sudan. In that region of the world, most of the work that I did was in next door, northern Uganda, because of the Lord's Resistance Army, and then slightly to the south in Rwanda, with post-genocide Rwanda. But Daisaku and I share some experience and interest in Afghanistan as well. So 5 quick points, none of which are to disagree, but I think they're things that are worth keeping in mind. And I've heard both Lual and I say, refer to some of these, the limitations of TCRMs. Mm-hmm. I think we need to keep those in mind, because initially when the transitional justice and peace and reconciliation scholarship, if you will, started to talk about this, there was this rush of eagerness to say, oh, well, external stuff is awful. What works is local, and anything that is local is good. And then we started saying that's not necessarily true. So let me just make 5 quick points, and then definitely hand it over to people for the Q&A. And these, as I said, these will sound negative. They're not meant to be. We all agree that TCRMs are important to consider. But things to bear in mind, and we've seen some of them noted in the presentations already. These mechanisms existed before the conflicts broke out. These mechanisms weren't sufficient, or they weren't relevant to prevent or deal with some of the causes of the conflict in the first place. And oftentimes, most times, the existence of these mechanisms is not why conflict has come to an end, assuming it has come to an end, if there has been a peace agreement. So that they weren't what halted the conflict. These TCRMs also may not be relevant to the nature of some of the violence that's taken place. What I'm thinking there particularly, you know, in northern Uganda, we had local traditions, drinking bitter root for if you want, reconciliation or reintegration of individuals. We had bending spears, all these local rituals. They weren't relevant to the scale, the nature, the type of the atrocities committed by the Lord's Resistance Army. So, and they weren't relevant to the conflict between Yoweri Museveni and the Acholi people, which is a political kind of conflict. So that's the first 3 points. The fourth, these are not mechanisms that, well, they're obviously not mechanisms that can address regional causes or regional exacerbation of conflict. And certainly the panelists here will know if you want the regional conflict there, what is now Sudan and South Sudan, but Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, and interventions from Rwanda and the spread of these across to the DRC and the Central African Republic, and the fact that those conflicts feed into each other. These kinds of mechanisms don't address that level of conflict. And the last point to make, and again, I've seen this in several of the commentaries. So again, this isn't something about which we disagree at all. Many of these mechanisms may be expressions of sets of values that the UN could not accept, or that international human rights do not accept. And we've seen those as you've all mentioned, you know, the male domination of some of these mechanisms. They may reflect local power imbalances, local power structures that are in fact part of the cause of some of these conflicts, not the mechanisms, but those power imbalances and inequalities. And while it is the last example that my friend Daisaku gave us about the Taliban and the Shura, they may have solved that in 4 days, but I wouldn't necessarily think that a lot of Afghan women are human rights advocates for women and girls' rights in Afghanistan are super interested in having the Taliban decide what their futures ought to be. In fact, quite the opposite. So, I mean, that's an extreme example, but many of these mechanisms also reflect things that external parties, and that's the problem, external parties would not be comfortable with in terms of advancing if we think peace should be advancing human rights and democratic values, these are not necessarily mechanisms that are relevant to that or appropriate to doing that. Okay, so I'll leave it there because I know there are many excellent questions, and personally I'd prefer to hear Lual and Issei and Daisaku address those questions. So thank you very much anyway for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. That's great. Yeah. No, this is a quite fundamental question that Arista actually gave us. So, Dr. Luar, you can see the Q&A, and you can respond to some of the questions. You can also respond to the comment by the Mr. Alistair. Yeah.
I've already responded to the 2 questions out of 5 under QA. But I fully agree with Alistair on the 5 points he has raised, and but some of which may be especially the last point, where there are things which could be incorporated or convince the UN to begin to accept some of them in a phase-out scenario. Question of, for instance, during the transitional period, you don't need to emphasize certain values like democratic principles and pluralism and all these things, because the transitional period is basically working towards those. So there needs to be some qualification and in those things. Also, the fact that the TCRM cannot address regional conflicts, he gave examples, and one will say true, but if the regional conflict has a local component coming from conflict on the border, between 2 communities on the border, you need TCRM to address that. Yeah, so we can also, so those are the 2 things I would say. It may not necessarily be entirely true that TCRM does not address conflicts. I would say it depends on the nature of conflict. Yeah, thank you.
Do you have some question that you want to? Yeah, you can see the question in the Q&A box, and you can respond to some of them later. Yeah. So Professor Kurimoto, do you want to answer some of the question to the Q&A box? And I also want to hear your opinion about Alistair's comment that TCRM actually might be one of the causes for the violent or civil war at first place. So how what could be the way?
Yes, basically, in principle, I agree with the points raised by Edgar. For instance, the before and after the armed conflict, the nature and degree of violence has changed, you know. For instance, if there is a conflict between 2 groups in which 1 or 2 persons were killed, and 5 or 10 heads of cattle were looted, that could be settled. But if for the case such as, hundreds of people are killed on both sides, tens of thousand cattle raided, how it can be settled? That's a question. But still, if people can really sit down and talk, there is still a way. That's what I believe. And in fact, that really happened in one Peace and Reconciliation conference. People counted up all the casualties in number. Then they realized, reached a conclusion. And the gap between the casualties, based on the gap, of the numbers, they paid compensation. That's what they agreed. So I think it is still possible. They can still manage that kind of extreme situation if it is well managed. And the case of Northern Sudan, Northern Uganda, among the Acholi, the case of drinking bitter root is of course I'm very aware of it. And Northern Uganda is just next to the South Sudan where I work. So it culturally it's the same, historically it's the same area. And for me, the case of drinking bitter root for peace and reconciliation, which has been very much, how do I put it, misused or overused. For me, it is a result of humanitarian intervention. I'm not sure where Edgar agrees or not. It is a result of wrong humanitarian intervention. So that's why a so-called TCRM among the people became misused or overused. And as a result of it, it became a kind of business for the Acholi themselves to do the ritual. Because if they do it, they can get some support from outside, from NGOs and whatever. So anyway, that is a very important lesson that we need to learn from the failures or mistakes of that case.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Deng, Lural, there are many good questions, but can you respond some of them? For example, there's a question from Miss Lagat, yeah. Mr. Deng?
Yeah, I've responded to some of them, but the question on Darfur region, I fully agree with him or her. I don't know what, yeah. I fully agree with that. There got to be some sensitization and to the communities so that they can accept new methods, especially question of women. The women are disadvantaged throughout Africa, whether in Muslims or Christian communities. So that requires some work, and that work we should leave it to social anthropologists than leaving it for humanitarian workers. Yeah, because the way Professor Kurmuto put it, and the way I've been observing in South Sudan, unfortunately, some of the humanitarian workers are increasingly becoming a problem. But if I take it narrowly from the economic point of view, it is an economic behavior. Because if my livelihood and my employment is based on that, then why do I earn it? It should continue virtually so that I continue to get employed. While on the other side, social anthropologists are morally researchers, and their interest is more objective, trying to find the truth. And they could be given that responsibility, and then they make recommendations to both humanitarian workers and also to the local authorities. That's what I would say on that question.
Great. Thank you very much. So you basically agreed my own point that maybe UN mission need to use more anthropologists, or the view of those people who have a very rich understanding on the text on that state. Yeah.
Absolutely, I agree with that, because that has been part of some of the problems that some of the UN missions are lacking. They are overloaded, I think, with soldiers or people with security background, and less with the people with the human aspect of social. I would call it social anthropologists.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, so yes, it might be. Yes.
Yeah, can I make one comment?
Yep.
Anyway, Dr. Luo, thanks very much for your comments on the role of social anthropologists. I really appreciate it, and I want to make one comment on the issue of women, on the exclusion and the participation of women, in particular regarding TCRMs. You know, any society is not static. Any society is changing. So if I compare South Sudanese society as of today and that of 30, 40 years ago, there are significant changes. And in particular about the position of women. So if you go to any local community meetings, you find women. So so now both men and women take it for granted that for any community meeting, there should be women. So this is a change that has happened during the last 30, 40 years. And some people learned it in refugee camps as a result of adult women education. And also, if we look at the National Legislative Assembly and the state assemblies, there are more women MPs in South Sudan than in Japan. I'm sorry to say. Doctor, you have more women MPs than in Japan.
Yeah. Japan has only 10% of the congressman. It's very shameful, yeah. And Professor Kurimoto, there's also one question from student Yuki Kato.
The culture of gun?
Yeah,
yeah, this is a simple,
culture, yeah.
It's a simple issue, because of the, first, so many light small arms and light weapons spread to the community. So almost, it's just like almost every man has a gun. And because many young men, they joined either National Army or rebel movement, so they have working experience as soldiers, either guerrilla soldiers or government army soldiers. So without discussing or without a dialogue, many people take a gun and just do things. So this is a culture of the gun, or culture of violence. So this is a result of how people's mentality in general became militarized. And that that should be changed.
Thank you very
It's not
much.
easy, but this is how it is. That's how elders, they fear young people, you know, because if they tell them don't do this and that, they may be shot simply. So this is the culture of the gun.
Thank you very much. Dr. Deng, there's also a question from both Naho Kimura in Japan and also Tet Hatatiet about how we can possibly include women into the decision-making process, even in the traditional mechanisms. So do you have some comment about that?
Yeah, we did. Yeah, as you already observed by Professor Kurmuto, that comparing South Sudan now and 40 years back, you know, under the SPLM system, they have now included, started from 25% to 35%. Even though they are not being observed, but then the women should begin to push because they are the majority. So when it comes to voting and they become well organized, they will make a difference. Unfortunately, the recent appointment to the cabinet, 35% are not being achieved. So that's in the cabinet, because it should be in the cabinet and also in the parliament and legislature or the assembly. It is the assembly where it is respected, because there are specific constituencies and seats for women to contest among themselves. They could also contest in geographical constituencies. So one could say you are making progress. They also, that's my personal view, a new culture coming whereby you find women, girls carrying guns. Become a problem when they should have been the one now to restrain. Even in traditional societies, women were never touched if there's a fight, and they not, and elderly and children. They are now being touched, and this is part of the progress. Professor Kurmuto did mention that shrines and all those things in the past, they were never touched. The recent conflict, that is not being respected. You have seen the White Army burning the shrines of the Dinkas as they pass on, and vice versa, Dinka doing the same thing. So one could say, you know, those of you who have read Chinua Achebe, things fall apart. And this is how you see things falling apart. But then you have Francis Deng. He's a South Sudanese. He's not my relative, but he's a Dinka. Talking about his book on what he called Transitional Integration. So meaning the tradition, and that's when I accepted your invitation to this panel. It's really, as you go, let us intentionally introduce positive new values into the old system, but in a more manageable way, so that things don't fall apart, because they fall apart when you introduce new things without preparation and so forth. So that's the challenge, and it is doable when you do it. I don't know in your case in Japan. I've been to I didn't go out. I've been only to Tokyo. That was when was it? I believe in 92. I think I went to in 92. Yes. And so there are some elements of tradition there. I think they are in Japan, and maybe the way they have been dying, maybe people can learn from them, and so forth, in a sort of violent change. And this is what South Sudan, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So yeah, it's important to recognize that every society is changing, and there's always possibility to transform even traditional mechanism into something which could be more acceptable for the person in the modern world. And also, yeah, I agree with Alistair's concern that some traditional conflict resolution mechanisms might be part of the reasons or causes for the conflict. And also, there might be some component that we cannot accept it. But at the same time, I really believe that it's important to have understanding, to know the situation. What is a traditional thought? Now, what is a traditional behavior codes? And what are the traditional cultures which actually give the, or which define kind of behavior of the peoples? It's one thing to know that, situation, or it's another thing about how to utilize those traditional mechanisms or value or cultures. I think one of the important lesson or historical lesson is that when United States occupied Japan in 1945, they needed to make a policy about occupation, right? So US occupation in Japan 75 years ago. And surprisingly, US Department or State Department hired 5 American experts on Japanese politics or Japanese society, Japanese administrations or Japanese cultures. And those the team under the State Department of the United States, which was consisted of 5 American experts on Japanese politics or Japanese culture, actually created a lot of very creative ideas on how to transform Japanese society into the modern world. So of course they did not embrace Japanese emperor as an almighty god. So of course they changed it, the Japanese emperor, into the very symbolic one. But they refuse or they oppose abolishing emperor system because they thought that it might be very difficult for Japan to be united if they lose that authorities. It was also true that they really recommended not to abolish entire Japanese bureaucracy, but they changed. They recommended how they can change Japanese bureaucracy into the very effective but also peaceful ones, not driven by the militarization. So I think it's one thing to know it, and it's another thing to think about how to use it. But I'm not quite sure that it's possible for UN mission to have a peaceful operation without knowing the traditional cultures, traditional mechanism, and the traditional way of thinking. We might need to change it, or we might need to have some persuasion or some dialogue to transform those mechanisms. But at least I think we need to start knowing those mechanisms and ideas and norm and culture. So that was my kind of convictions.
Yeah, Professor Higashi, can
yes.
there's a comment on chat from
Yep.
talking about if Chris could maybe elaborate, it's saying how important topic social anthropologists had technical problem. Welcome exchange email with any of panelists. But I would, if he's still listening, can he tell us what kind of technical problem?
No, they unfortunately they cannot speak out. So can
he can be asked to write because it's writing in chat. So
yeah.
if we could write, I don't know what the few minutes, but I've taken his email. I'll send him an email.
That's great. That's great. Yeah.
But the question is all to all panelists. The question is all panelists.
Daisaku.
Yes, we have just 5 minutes left, but yeah, please speak.
But if I can have,
but I think the most important aspect of TCRMs is the idea of justice, restorative justice, not retributive. And in today also in developed countries in the West, including Japan, the lawyers started thinking how to introduce retributive justice. So, you know, in that sense, the so-called traditional conflict resolution mechanism based on restorative justice
Restorative justice.
is important. Also can be a model, even for us, you know, because putting somebody in prison because of the crime that he committed does not solve a problem. And however, restorative justice can solve it. And after solving it, they can stay together again. And for me, this is very important.
Thank you so much.
I was going to say,
yeah, please.
That unfortunately, the Americans did not use the model they applied to Japan when they invaded Kuwait, sorry.
Iraq. Yeah.
And dismantle everything, and that country is unstable up to now. So it's very important to send in not necessarily political scientists, but social anthropologists, I believe. I think the Americans, and they send in political scientists after the military in Iraq. And the political scientists thought the best way was to dismantle that system and put a new one. And had they sent social anthropologists, they would have said, no, wait a minute, you don't do that. Yeah. And so you have a strong point there, Professor Kurumuto, that we need really to respect the traditional conflict resolution mechanism. And they use it in Iraq. Iraq is stable now.
Yeah. No, that's a great comment. I think it's a contrast between the U.S. occupation in Japan 75 years ago and the U.S. occupation in Iraq 15 years ago is a huge, give us huge lesson, I think. Yeah. So I really appreciate your comment. It's a little bit tough comment for like me and Alistair who are political science, but it might be very true that it's better to use anthropologists. But thank you very much. Yeah.
Not all political scientists thought that what the American political scientists good. Let me just say that.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry that we are running out of time. I think it will be automatically cut off 11:20. But thank you so much for your participation and the great questions. And I was very honored to moderate this session with such a great speakers and commentators, including Alistair. So thank you very much, and hopefully we have another opportunity to discuss this important issue. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Luar. Thank you, Alistair. Thank you, Professor Kurimoto.
Thank you.